The Great Hall of Transcendence on the Star-Forge of Xylos was not built for humans. It was built for gods, for conquerors, and for entities that breathed the dust of dying stars. Elias Thorne sat in seat 8902, a cold, metallic slab designed for an avian species with 4 knees. To the galaxy, Elias was a rounding error. He was the representative of a Tier 4 biological curiosity Earth. While the High Lords of the Andromeda Core discussed the restructuring of entire solar systems, Elias was just trying to figure out how to sit without his legs going numb. He was a speck of dust in a room full of hurricanes. But in 3 minutes, every single one of those hurricanes would stop blowing. The atmosphere in the forge was suffocating. Thousands of alien delegates looked down toward the center podium from their hovering bioluminescent platforms. The air tasted like ozone and ancient pride. Humans had only been on the galactic stage for 50 years. In cosmic terms, that's less than a heartbeat. We were the newcomers who hadn't even mastered faster-than-light travel without leaking radiation. To the Council, we weren't a threat. We were a pet project that was quickly losing its novelty. Elias adjusted his suit, feeling the sweat prickle at the back of his neck. He knew why he was here. He was the sacrificial lamb. The Council was about to vote on the resource redistribution of the Sol system. In plain English, they were going to strip mine Earth's asteroid belt and leave the planet to starve in the dark. He was there to protest, a formality the Council allowed so they could maintain the illusion of justice. Hold on before we get into the real stuff. I want to know. What are you doing at this exact moment while hearing my voice? I love seeing your answers down below in the comments. As the High Arbiter, a towering crystalline entity known as the Shard, shimmered into the center of the arena, a hush fell over the crowd. The Shard didn't speak with words. It vibrated, sending thoughts directly into the minds of the trillions watching across the subspace net. The matter of the Sol system is settled, the vibration echoed. The biologicals known as humans have failed to provide a significant contribution to the collective. Their assets are forfeit. Elias stood up. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. I object, he shouted, his voice cracking slightly in the vastness of the hall. A ripple of mocking laughter, a dozen different frequencies of chirps, growls, and clicks erupted from the stands. A representative from the Thraxian hegemony, a creature that looked like a mountain of armored muscle, leaned over his balcony. Sit down, little ape. You are lucky we don't charge you for the oxygen you're wasting. Elias looked around. Not a single ally. Not a single friendly face. Just a galaxy full of predators waiting for the kill. He opened his mouth to speak again, to plead for his home, but the words died in his throat. The temperature in the room suddenly plummeted. Not a gradual chill, but a flash freeze that turned the breath of every delegate into crystals of ice. The bioluminescent lights of the forge turned a deep, bruising violet. Then, the great doors that hadn't been opened in 10,000 years began to groan. Something was coming. Something that made the High Arbiter, a literal sentient diamond, begin to tremble. The laughter stopped instantly. The silence was so heavy it felt like it could crush bone. A shadow began to bleed across the floor, stretching from the entrance all the way to the center podium. And from that shadow stepped a figure that shouldn't exist outside of terrifying legends. She moved with a grace that defied physics, her skin shimmering like the surface of a black hole. She didn't look at the Council. She didn't look at the Arbiter. She scanned the thousands of seats, her eyes burning with the light of a billion extinguished suns, until her gaze locked directly onto the nosebleed section. Directly onto Elias. She raised a single slender finger, pointing straight at his chest. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was a physical weight. On Axion Prime, silence usually meant a microphone had failed or a translation matrix had glitched. This was different. This was the silence of a graveyard at the edge of the universe. 10,000 species from the gaseous clouds of the Jovian systems to the silicon-based titans of the Outer Rim held their collective breath. They weren't looking at the High Arbiter anymore. They weren't looking at the holographic star charts. Every single eye, sensor, and heat signature pit was locked on Elias Thorne. Elias felt the cold radiating from that pointed finger. It wasn't the cold of ice. It was the cold of deep space, the absolute zero where all motion stops. The woman, if you could call a being made of starlight and obsidian a woman, didn't move. Her hand remained perfectly still, her finger a jagged needle aimed at his heart. "That one," her voice rang out. It didn't come from her throat. It didn't come from the speakers. It resonated within the very marrow of Elias's bones. "That one belongs to me." The High Arbiter's crystalline form began to fracture, tiny spiderwebs of light cracking across its torso. "Excellency," the Arbiter vibrated, its tone no longer commanding but desperate, almost whimpering. The protocol of Xylos dictates that the Sol system is." "I do not care for your protocols, Pebble," she interrupted. She didn't raise her voice, but the walls of the Star-Forge groaned as if the gravity of a gas giant had suddenly tripled. "I do not care for your borders. I do not care for your petty hunger for minerals and ores." She began to walk. She didn't use the walkways. She stepped onto the empty air, and with every footfall, a ripple of violet energy pulsed outward, knocking the hovering platforms of the High Lords out of alignment. Representatives scrambled, their multi-limbed bodies tangling in a panic to stay upright as their gravity stabilizers failed. Elias watched her approach. Up close, she was terrifyingly beautiful. Her hair seemed to be composed of nebulae, swirling with the birth of stars. Her armor was crafted from the collapsed core of a white dwarf. She was the Empress of the Void, the matriarch of the Silent Fold, a being the Council spoke of only in hushed, terrified whispers, a myth they hoped would never wake up. And she was coming for the guy from Earth who had a mortgage and a cat. The Thraxian hegemony representative, the one who had mocked Elias just moments ago, tried to regain some semblance of dignity. He stood his ground as she floated past his balcony. "This is an outrage!" The armored beast roared, his mandibles clicking in fury. "The human species is a Tier 4 nothing. They have no history, no legacy. By what right do you?" The Empress didn't even turn her head. She simply flicked her wrist. A localized rift in spacetime opened for a microsecond. In the blink of an eye, the Thraxian's massive armored body was simply gone. There was no blood. No scream, just an empty seat where a warlord had been standing. The vacuum of the rift sucked the surrounding air with a sharp pop, leaving the scent of ozone and terrified sweat. The entire hall recoiled. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was a harvest. She reached Elias's section. The avian species next to him scrambled over each other to get away, their feathers flying in a frantic cloud of panic. Elias stood alone in his row, his knees shaking, his breath hitching in his chest. He was a diplomat, trained in negotiation and compromise. But how do you negotiate with an entity that just deleted a planetary governor for speaking out of turn? She stopped 3 feet in front of him, hovering just off the edge of the platform. The violet light from her eyes was blinding. "Elias Thorne," she whispered, and the name sounded like a prayer and a death sentence all at once. "Why me?" Elias managed to choke out. We're just humans. We haven't done anything. We don't even have a legacy worth claiming." The Empress leaned in closer. The smell of cold iron and ancient roses filled his senses. A small, dark smile played across her lips, a look of predatory recognition. "You think your history began 50 years ago when you reached the stars?" she asked. Her hand reached out, not to strike him, but to gently brush the air near his cheek. "You think you are new? You are the descendants of the ones who broke the first cage. You carry the blood of the architects who built the very stars this council tries to sell." She turned back to the council, her voice growing cold again, booming like a drum in a hollow cave. "The Sol system is under my protection. Any ship that crosses the Kuiper Belt will be erased from existence. Any decree passed against this man's home will be seen as an act of war against the void itself." The High Arbiter shimmered weakly. "But why?" Why would a being of the fold care for a primitive biological? The Empress turned her gaze back to Elias, and for a second, he saw something in her eyes that wasn't cold or distant. He saw a terrifying, ancient hunger. "Because," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous purr that reached every corner of the galaxy, "I have been looking for my mate for 1,000,000 years. And I finally found him." The entire galaxy fell silent. And Elias realized that being ignored by the Council was a heaven compared to being noticed by the void. The word mate hit the chamber like a kinetic bombardment. In the high-oxygen atmosphere of the Star-Forge, you could practically hear the collective brain circuitry of 10,000 species short-circuiting. The High Arbiter's crystalline structure turned a muddy, shocked gray. The delegates from the Rigel sector, translucent beings who communicated through light pulses, began strobing in a frantic, panicked rhythm. Elias Thorne felt like the floor had vanished. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a warrior. He was a man who enjoyed rainy Tuesdays and historical biographies. Now he was being claimed by a primordial force of nature in front of a live galactic broadcast. I think there's been a mistake," Elias stammered, his voice sounding thin and fragile against the hum of her power. "I'm just a diplomat. I've never even been outside the Sol system before this trip. You're a goddess of the void. I'm just a human." The Empress didn't flinch. She drifted closer, her feet never touching the metal floor. The air around her warped, blurring the edges of reality. When she reached out, her fingers didn't feel like flesh. They felt like the pull of a distant moon. She tucked a stray strand of hair behind Elias's ear, and the touch sent a jolt of pure, raw energy through his nervous system that made his vision swim with silver sparks. "A mistake?" she whispered, her voice a velvet caress that could strip the atmosphere off a planet. "Elias, I have watched your lineage since the first of your kind looked at the moon and wondered if they could reach it. I have waded through the rise and fall of your empires, through your wars and your wonders. Your soul carries the frequency of the first architects, the ones who taught my kind how to sing the universe into being." She turned her head slightly, her gaze sweeping over the trembling council. "They see a Tier 4 biological. They see a resource to be harvested. They see a weakness to be exploited." Her eyes flared with a sudden violent intensity. "I see the spark that lit the first sun. And I do not share my fire." Below them, the High Arbiter found its voice, though it vibrated with a jagged, crystalline fear. "Excellency, if this human is indeed of such importance, then the Treaty of the Sol System is null, but the Council must have proof. We cannot simply cede an entire sector based on—" The Empress didn't let him finish. She didn't even look at him. She simply snapped her fingers. The massive holographic star chart in the center of the hall, a display that took the power of a small moon to maintain, instantly flickered and changed. It no longer showed trade routes or military borders. It showed a DNA strand, but it wasn't a standard double helix. It was a complex multi-dimensional geometry that glowed with a golden light. "Look at his code," she commanded. Scientific officers across the hall scrambled to their consoles. Screams of disbelief began to erupt from the research tiers. "It's impossible!" A scientist from the Lyra Nebula shrieked. "The dormant sequences, they aren't junk DNA, they're coordinates, they're Stargate keys." Elias stared at the golden light. He felt a strange heat beginning to pulse in the center of his chest, right where his heart was supposed to be. It wasn't painful, but it was heavy. It felt like a door that had been locked for 1,000,000 years was finally beginning to creak open. "Humans were never meant to be the servants of the galaxy," the Empress said, her voice growing louder, filling the lungs of every creature in the room. "They were the guardians of the Great Silence, and you dared to vote on their extinction?" The gravity in the room shifted again. This time, Elias felt himself rising. Not because of a tractor beam, but because the very space he occupied was being lifted by her will. He floated beside her, a common man in a cheap suit, held aloft by the Queen of the End Times, The High Arbiter began to retreat, its hovering platform drifting backward toward the shadows. We did not know. The records were lost. The archives of the first ones were destroyed in the Great Collapse. Then let this be your new record, the Empress declared. She reached out and took Elias's hand. Her grip was firm, ancient, and terrifyingly possessive. Earth is no longer a member of your council. Soul is no longer a territory for your expansion. From this moment forward, humanity is under the sovereignty of the void. She looked at Elias, her expression softening into something that looked dangerously like love. And Elias Thorne is no longer a diplomat. He is the prince of the silent fold. Elias looked down at the thousands of alien faces, the same faces that had been laughing at him 5 minutes ago. Now they were bowing. They were prostrating themselves in their seats, terrified that even looking at him would be seen as an act of defiance. But as the Empress began to turn, leading him toward the great doors, a dark metallic voice boomed from the shadows of the upper tiers. "The void does not rule alone," the voice growled. A massive mechanical entity, a machine god from the Dyson spheres of the north, stepped into the light. And the machine intelligence does not recognize the claims of biological ghosts. If the human is a key, then the machines will have that key. By force, if necessary. The Empress froze. The violet light in her hair turned to a deep blood red. The cliffhanger hung in the air like a bared blade. The machine god, a terrifying construct known as the arch-architect of the null sector, didn't walk. It unfolded. Standing 40 feet tall, its body was a nightmare of shifting gears, liquid metal, and glowing red optical sensors that processed 1 billion combat scenarios per second. It represented the synthetic concordance, a civilization that had purged all biological weakness eons ago. To them, the Empress was just a high-level energy signature, and Elias was nothing more than a carbon-based biological latch. The sovereignty of the void is a ghost story told to frighten primitive worlds, the arch-architect boomed, its voice a discordant symphony of grinding metal. The human holds the geometric keys to the precursor gates. Our simulations confirm that his genetic frequency is the only resonance capable of unlocking the core. He is not a prince, he is a tool. And the concordance does not allow tools to be hoarded. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Challenging the Empress was suicide, or it was the start of a war that would crack the galaxy in half. Elias felt the Empress's hand tighten around his. Her skin, once cool, was now burning with an internal white dwarf heat. "A tool?" she repeated, and the word vibrated with a lethal, quiet fury. "You, who are made of recycled scrap and cold logic, dare to speak of tools?" "Logic dictates efficiency," the machine god countered. Its massive right arm shifted, transforming into a localized singularity cannon. The hum of the weapon charging up was a sound that made the air itself scream. Relinquish the biological, or the Star-Forge of Xylos becomes a supernova. The council went into a full-blown riot. High lords jumped from their platforms. Avian species crashed into the walls in their haste to reach the emergency shuttles. The High Arbiter simply dimmed its lights and retreated into a defensive shell. They knew what was coming. When two apex powers clashed, the bystanders were merely fuel for the fire. Elias looked at the singularity cannon aimed directly at his chest. He should have been terrified, and he was, but that strange heat in his heart was growing. It wasn't just heat anymore. It was a rhythm, a pulse. It felt like a drumbeat echoing from 1 billion years ago. He looked at the Empress. "Don't," Elias whispered. She looked at him, her violet eyes flashing with surprise. "They threaten you, Elias. They seek to take you to a cold lab and pull your soul apart to see how it works." "I know," Elias said, his voice gaining a strange, resonant strength he didn't recognize. "But if you fight him here, you'll kill everyone in this room. You'll kill the representatives of 10,000 worlds." "Is that what I am? A reason to commit genocide?" The Empress paused. For a fleeting second, the terrifying goddess looked almost human. She looked at the man she had claimed a man who, even in the face of a machine god, was worried about the very people who had just mocked him. "You truly are of the first blood," she breathed. "Compassion. The greatest flaw and the most dangerous weapon." The arch-architect didn't wait for the sentiment to finish. Target locked. Initiating acquisition. The singularity cannon fired. A ball of absolute darkness, a point of infinite density, tore through the air toward Elias and the Empress. It moved faster than the eye could follow, warping the light and the very architecture of the hall as it traveled. It was a shot designed to collapse a star, but it never hit. Elias didn't know why he did it. He didn't think. He simply stepped in front of the Empress and raised his hand. The hall went silent again, but this time it was a silence born of impossibility. The black sphere of the singularity didn't explode. It didn't crush Elias. It simply stopped. It hovered an inch from his palm, spinning harmlessly, its terrifying power being absorbed into the golden glow emanating from his skin. Elias stared at his own hand. The golden geometry from the holographic chart was now visible under his skin, glowing like a circuit board of the gods. The machine god's sensors turned a frantic blinking yellow. Error, singularity neutralized, source, unknown. Analysis, impossible. Elias looked up at the 40-foot titan. He didn't feel like a Tier 4 biological anymore. He felt like the owner of the house, and the machine was just a noisy vacuum cleaner. "My home isn't for sale," Elias said, his voice echoing with 1,000 layered tones. "And I am not a key." He closed his fist. The singularity, the concentrated power of a dying star, didn't dissipate. It folded. It turned inside out and snapped back toward the machine god with 10 times its original velocity. The arch-architect barely had time to raise its shields before the very weapon it had fired tore through its chassis, collapsing the machine god into a ball of crushed titanium the size of a marble. The marble hit the floor with a heavy clink. Elias stood there, his hands still glowing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He turned to the Empress, expecting her to be proud. Instead, he saw something else in her eyes. It wasn't just love anymore. It was a deep, ancient fear. Because the key hadn't just turned in the lock. The door was wide open, and something from the beginning of time was looking back through it. The golden light under Elias's skin wasn't fading. If anything, it was intensifying, pulses of amber radiance traveling up his veins like liquid suns. The remains of the machine god, 1 billion credits worth of hyper-advanced processing power, lay on the floor as a crushed, silent sphere. The High Lords who hadn't already fled were paralyzed. They weren't just witnessing a political shift. They were witnessing the biological equivalent of a supernova. "Elias," the Empress whispered, her voice trembling. She reached out, but for the first time she didn't touch him. She hovered her hand inches away, as if afraid the heat coming off him would unmake her. "The resonance, it's too high. Your physical form wasn't built to sustain the core frequency for this long." Elias looked at his hands. They were translucent now. He could see the structural geometry of his own bones, glowing like white phosphorus. The drumbeat in his chest had grown into a roar, a rhythmic vibration that matched the spinning of the Star-Forge itself. He didn't feel pain. He felt everywhere. He could feel the breathing of the avian species in the rafters. He could feel the cooling metal of the dead machine god. He could feel the tectonic plates of the planet below shifting in response to his heartbeat. "I can hear them," Elias said, his voice sounding like a choir of 1,000 versions of himself. "The ones who came before, they didn't leave, Empress. They just folded themselves into the silence." "Stop," she pleaded, her violet eyes wide with a frantic protective ancientness. "If you unlock the full sequence, you won't be Elias Thorne anymore. You'll be the singularity. You'll be a god with no memory of being a man." But the council wasn't finished. From the high-security bunkers beneath the forge, a secondary defense system surged. The High Arbiter, sensing its own obsolescence, had triggered the Oblivion Protocol. If the council couldn't control the key, they would burn the lock. Massive stabilizer pylons, the size of skyscrapers, began to retract. The Star-Forge was losing its orbit. It began to tilt, the artificial gravity screaming as it tried to compensate for the sudden plunge toward the gas giant below. Screams filled the air as delegates were tossed from their platforms like ragdolls. "The Arbiter is scuttling the station." The Empress snarled, her fear instantly replaced by a cold, murderous focus. She turned toward the central podium, her obsidian armor flaring with violet lightning. "I will tear that crystal into sand for this." "No," Elias said. He didn't move, but the word itself acted like a physical barrier, stopping the Empress in her tracks. He looked down at the chaos below, the thousands of innocent lives, the terrified representatives of worlds that had never known anything but the Council's law. He saw a young Lyrian mother clutching her child as their platform spiraled toward the abyss. Earth had taught Elias one thing: we aren't defined by our power, but by what we do when we have it. He closed his eyes. He stopped fighting the golden fire in his blood. He let it take him. He let the Elias part of his mind, the part that loved coffee and worried about lake fees, sink into the ocean of the first blood. "I've got it," he murmured. Elias stepped off the platform. He didn't float. He simply ceased to be in one place and appeared in the center of the forge. He spread his arms wide. The golden light erupted from his chest in a colossal wave, a shockwave of pure creation that hit the falling pylons and froze them in midair. The station stopped plunging. The gravity stabilized with a gentle hum. The golden energy didn't just hold the station. It began to repair it. Metal fused back together. Systems that had been dead for centuries flickered to life. The Star-Forge wasn't just being saved. It was being upgraded, but the cost was visible. Every time a circuit was repaired, Elias's image flickered. He was becoming less solid, less human. The Empress descended toward him, her feet finally touching the floor as she rushed into the golden storm. "Elias, stop! You've saved them! Enough! Pull back or you'll vanish." He looked at her, and for a split second, the golden light in his eyes softened back to a human brown. He reached out and touched her face. This time, his hand was solid. "You said you've been looking for your mate for 1,000,000 years, he whispered, a small, sad smile on his lips. "Yes," she choked out, tears of liquid light spilling down her cheeks. "Then don't look for a man," Elias said, his body beginning to dissolve into a cloud of golden embers. "Look for the stars." With a final blinding flash, the golden light expanded to fill the entire star system. When the light faded, the great hall was silent. The Star-Forge was pristine, glowing with a new ancient power. The Council was safe. But seat 8902 was empty. Elias Thorne was gone. The Empress stood in the center of the hall, her head bowed. The galaxy watched through the cameras, waiting to see if she would burn the universe down in her grief. She slowly looked up. She didn't look angry. She looked expectant. She looked toward the great doors, which were slowly swinging open once more. But it wasn't a human who walked through. It was a messenger from Earth, a simple drone, carrying a single physical piece of paper. The Empress took the paper. On it were 4 words written in Elias's messy handwriting. The 4 words written on that crinkled, unremarkable piece of paper were, "Look up, I'm home." The Empress didn't cry. Instead, a laugh, a sound like the chime of crystal bells, escaped her lips. She looked up, past the vaulted ceilings of the Star-Forge, past the atmosphere of the gas giant, and into the deep black of the void. And there, it began. Every star in the visible quadrant began to pulse. It wasn't a random flicker or a cosmic glitch. It was a rhythm, a heartbeat. The golden frequency of the first blood wasn't just a weapon. It was a network. Elias hadn't died. He had uploaded. He had become the architect he was always meant to be. He had merged with the very fabric of the universe, turning the silence of the fold into a roaring, living symphony. Suddenly, the High Arbiter's voice cracked through the room, desperate to regain control of the narrative. The human has ascended. This This is an unprecedented violation of galactic sovereignty. We must contain this energy. We must, the Empress turned. The grief was gone, replaced by a terrifying, radiant smugness. Contain it? She asked, her voice echoing the same layered, multi-toned resonance Elias had just displayed. You cannot contain the air you breathe, little pebble. You cannot contain the light that hits your eyes. He isn't just a man anymore. He is the system. As if to prove her point, every screen in the Star-Forge, every holographic display, and every personal comlink across the entire galaxy flickered to life. It didn't show the Council's logo. It showed Earth, but it wasn't the Earth the galaxy knew. It wasn't a Tier 4 curiosity struggling with climate change and resource scarcity. The image showed a world wrapped in a shimmering, golden lattice of energy. The moon had been transformed into a luminous beacon, and the asteroid belt, the one the Council had voted to strip mine, was being reshaped by invisible hands into a series of massive orbital shipyards. Humanity wasn't just being protected. They were being upgraded. In the streets of London, Tokyo, and New York, people were looking at their own hands. The same golden geometry was flickering under their skin. It wasn't as intense as Elias's, but it was there. The junk DNA of an entire species was waking up. The sovereignty of the void was just the beginning, the Empress announced to the stunned Council. You thought you were the masters of the house. You thought the humans were the pests in the walls. But you forgot who built the walls in the first place. The High Arbiter's crystalline body began to dim, its power source being bypassed by the new golden grid Elias had established. What happens to us? The Arbiter whispered. The Empress stepped toward the central podium and sat in the Arbiter's chair. She leaned back, crossing her legs with the grace of a supernova. That depends, she said, her eyes glowing with a violet fire that now danced with sparks of Elias's gold. Elias is a man of peace. He wants to see if you can be taught. He wants to see if the galaxy is ready to join the true collective. She leaned forward, her gaze piercing through the cameras to every corner of the universe. But I am the Empress of the Void, and I am far less patient than my mate. The humans are coming to take their seat at the head of this table. You can move your chairs, or you can be cleared away like the dust you are. From the shadows of the Great Hall, a new sound began to grow. It wasn't the sound of machines or the screams of aliens. It was the sound of 1,000 human voices, broadcasting from Earth, singing a song that hadn't been heard in 1 billion years. It was the song of the first architects. And then, the great doors opened one last time. A fleet of ships, unlike anything the Council had ever seen, sleek, golden, and powered by the light of captive stars, dropped out of warp directly inside the Star-Forge's docking bay. The first human diplomats had arrived, and they weren't carrying briefcases. They were carrying the authority of the universe itself. But as the first human stepped onto the platform, his eyes glowing with that unmistakable amber light, the Empress's smile faltered. She felt a ripple in the void, a cold, sharp puncture in the golden net Elias had woven. Somewhere in the dark spaces between galaxies, something else had heard the song. And it was hungry. The puncture in the golden net didn't just feel like a glitch. It felt like a scream in a silent room. Across the Star-Forge, the golden human diplomats froze. The Empress stood up, her obsidian armor shivering. For the first time in an eternity, she felt a cold that didn't belong to her. From the deepest, darkest reaches of intergalactic space, a shadow was blooming. It was the Great Hunger, a swarm of entities that had consumed entire dimensions before the first architects had even sparked the first sun. They were the reason the architects had hidden their power in the junk DNA of a primitive ape species on a backwater planet. They were the reason for the silence. By waking up, humanity hadn't just claimed their throne. They had lit a flare in a forest full of wolves. The council chamber shook. But this wasn't the orbital decay from before. The very fabric of reality was being gnawed at. A jagged rift tore open in the center of the hall, bleeding a color that wasn't part of the visible spectrum, a void deeper and more hateful than the one the Empress ruled. "They are here," the Empress breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "The Eaters of Light." The High Arbiter turned a pale, translucent white. "We are lost. The legends said they would return if the song was ever sung again." But then, the golden light in the room didn't dim, it intensified. It began to pull together, swirling into a central point right in front of the rift. The golden embers coalesced, thickening and hardening until the shape of a man began to form. Elias Thorne stepped out of the light. He wasn't the flickering ghost he had been minutes ago. He looked solid, real, and utterly calm. He wore no armor, just the same cheap suit he'd arrived in, now glowing with a soft, persistent radiance. He looked at the Empress and nodded a silent promise kept. Then, he turned his back on the council and faced the rift. From the darkness of the tier, a claw the size of a starship reached out, made of nothing but teeth and frozen time. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't summon a fleet. He simply reached out and placed a hand on the edge of the rift. "You've been hungry for a long time," Elias said, his voice echoing through every soul in the galaxy. "But this house is no longer empty. And we don't feed the monsters anymore." He didn't use violence, he used definition. He projected the collective memory of humanity, the warmth of a summer day, the sting of a first love, the stubborn refusal to give up when the odds are zero. He flooded the rift with the sheer, messy, beautiful weight of being alive. The claw recoiled. The hateful colors began to fade, neutralized by the absolute certainty of Elias's will. The rift didn't just close. It healed, weaving itself back together until the air was as smooth as glass. The silence returned, but it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of a new beginning. Elias turned back to the room. He looked at the terrified aliens, the stunned humans, and the Empress who was looking at him like he was the only star in the sky. "The galaxy is a big place," Elias said, his voice now back to its normal human tone, though it carried a weight that could move planets. "There's room for everyone. But the days of empires and resource mining at the cost of lives are over. We are the architects, and we're inviting you to help us build something better." The Empress walked toward him, her hand finding his. This time, there was no fear of vanishing. They stood together, the Queen of the Void and the Man of the Stars. The High Arbiter bowed its head, followed by the Thraxian survivors, the Lyrians, and every other delegate. The kids' table was gone. Earth wasn't just a member, it was the heart. "What now?" the Empress asked softly. Elias looked out the great doors at the infinite horizon of stars. Now we go home. I think I left the oven on." A ripple of genuine warm laughter echoed through the Star-Forge, the first time that hall had ever heard such a human sound. The galaxy wasn't falling silent anymore. It was finally starting to speak. Don't forget to subscribe to HFY Soundscape and turn on that notification bell so you never miss a transmission.